Good afternoon. I'm Sou Fujimoto, and I will talk 10 minutes and quickly talk about my thinking relating to the segments and the whole, and then the pieces I did. Ways of
if you stand up there, maybe it's easier.
You can stand or you can sit. It's okay.
Okay.
It's all relaxed.
Yeah, maybe I will sit here.
It's Friday afternoon.
This time, we call our project Open Cave. And I have been interested in those kind of the relationship between nature and architecture. So how we can imagine such a natural environment as an inspiration of architecture. And it started really long time ago. It's almost like 18 years ago, the year 2001, when I made very simple conceptual model for future living environment, inspired by this Le Corbusier's domino, not just inspired, but kind of criticizing and reinvent those kind of simple systems in a various different way. And this was the model. And it is that each plate has a gap of 35 centimeter, or it could be 40 centimeter. It means you can sit on it, or it could be used as a shelves, or the double size could be work as a table. So fragments of those kind of pieces, or fragmentation of the size of the one floor, 4 meter or 5 meter, into the 10% scales, and then reassemble those kind of fragments to recreate our living environment. Because I thought it is creating such a human scale interactions between your behaviors and the space. But it's not only just the human scales and tiny scales, but it could be repeated to be finally in architectural scales or landscape scales or something like that. So those kind of the segments or the small parts, small pieces could make interactions to each other, each pieces to each other, and then each pieces to your human behaviors. Those kind of interactions could create the kind of the soft order of the whole. So that was the very starting point of the ideas, to recreate. Because I thought at that time, the key of the architecture design, one of the key of the architecture design was how we reintegrate those kind of different scales, from tiny scales to the middle scales, the larger scales, and the huge scales, till from the furniture, architecture, to the city and urban environment, or landscape. So those kind of the different types of the reintegrations was intended. And then later, 6-7 years later, I had a chance to create this very tiny cabin in Japan, the same concept again. And then, of course, this is reflecting the same concept for this exhibition piece of me. And stacking those timber blocks of 35 centimeter to create kind of a cave-like spaces. And then, you don't see any obvious functions, but once you are inside, you almost like unintentionally could find the comfortable space for you to sit, or moving around, or hiding, or to make a communication with the different levels. So those kind of the interactive relationships, which could be beyond the modernism, functionalism. And then this is a private house we did almost like 8 years ago in Tokyo. And different way, the module is more like open, the various different gaps. But again, those kind of small fragments, or subdivision of the floors are recomposed to create the field for the people's life. And those kind of redefining the scale of architectures, and then each pieces of the floors, it is not connected, but it's not like far away. It is always like interactive to each other. So each part is like a one segment, but then together with the other things, the meaning of each segment is always redefined in the relationships of the others. So that was also quite interesting for me, because it's not just happening in architecture, it's also happening in the urban situation, and it's also happening in the relationship of the peoples and the conversations. So that's quite like wide meanings I had. And then, of course, the Serpentine Pavilion has also the same philosophy. And in this case, they're 40 centimeter and then really transparent frames. But so, yeah, if you see these photos, it's almost like you will be lost in such a, the grids or matrix. But once you are in front of the frames, then it is really like a physical existence. And then you start to interact almost like unexpectedly, beyond your intentions, so conversation between your body and behaviors and the space starts. An interesting point of this project was, of course, it was like a public space, open to everybody, so anybody could come in, quite open, but you can find your own quite personal, protected one spaces for you, while all the other people are moving around you. So it's like a beautiful contrast or integration of such a private, intimate scales and publicness. And then, of course, next moment, you could encounter with your friends unexpectedly, or you start the conversations, then the whole situation could be changed in the same frames, in a sense. So those kind of the richness of the diversities could be created by such a simple interactions between your behaviors or human body and each segment. And then this is the latest project I am doing in France. This is rather larger project, but again, kind of each segment as a balconies are interacting to each other with your neighbors to create new typology of the, living together, like a community or the neighborhood feelings. And yeah, of course, exterior, it's crazy, but it is kind of course, the location is in Montpellier, so the Mediterranean climate. So it's just simply nice to have such a huge balconies. And then, of course, as an exterior view, it is making a huge impact. But not only about those kind of a simple reaction to the climate. This is creating, as you can see, of course, you have the richness of the open platforms in the good weather, but then you are softly surrounded by your neighbors and half protected but half open, and you can choose to start conversation with them or not. It is quite like a loose but rich interactive relationships to each other. And these kind of a new way of neighborhood or new way of the community could have, I believe, the potentials for the future, I think, society in a sense. Because it's not super divided, but it's not completely open. It is kind of your territory is protected, but half open, and their territory is protected, but half open. And then you can choose whatever kind of the interactions, relationships, not only one by one, but 2, 3 others could join to your conversations to each other. So I believe those kind of loose relationships could be created by the thinking of the segment and the whole, or the fragments and the whole, and so on. So I believe this thinking has quite important meanings, fundamental meanings for architecture and our society in the future. Yeah, some of the balconies are connected by the sky staircases. So those 2 are owned by the one apartment, but then the others always surrounding you. And then this is the one we created this time. So it is like the simple representation of my thinkings for this more than 15, 16 years. And yeah, again, this is kind of yeah, I think it's quite fundamental, exciting topics. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sellest müürituse ladumisest.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about the ideas behind and the development of our segment in the curatorial exhibition. Yael and I have collaborated on several things over the years. This is probably the most intense of them in terms of stress and surprise. Beauty making life much more tense, I think, in the sense that I was interested in exploring certain areas that were to do with how to use computing as a way of accelerating what I could do. And at the same time, Yael was very conscious of the fact that this is also about beauty, and that is a major focus. For me, it was intrinsic in the process, but it was very important that we got it right. The background to the project, we very briefly showed some work yesterday. This is a competition project Yael put together in which year, Yael?
2010.
In 2010. 2012. And it enjoys the creation of a very private space in a very public place. On the South Bank with the undercroft covered in graffiti. On the top we have this tender object with these niches that provide protection with artwork which lines the openings and creates these collars opening out into the city. This was one of the starting points for our project. Another starting point for it was a research project Yael had done, which looked at the way that plants can enhance the quality of our life and our environment in the house. And this is the Magic Garden project. And these two elements were a core starting point for the project from Yael's perspective, and a major driver in how we designed it. From my end, I was interested in, can we create recipes and systems that generate parts of the city in a way that allows us as individual designers to create something more complex than we might have imagined. And the Lego City in Lille was one of these projects from my past that I felt gave a starting point. So I started looking at how we could use computer simulation to grow things. I thought, let's plant seeds and let the seeds grow and see what happens with them. And for me, it was the opportunity to start using technologies that I hadn't had a chance to play with for a long time. In this case, Houdini, which is a fantastic visual effects program. I'm not any good at it, but it gave me the chance to look at how evolving systems might be useful. So one of the first ideas was, okay, you can plant seeds, they can grow. You plant lots of seeds, they've got to compete with each other. Can we create an urban quarter which is grown by using the seeding technique, but also it forms itself as a consequence of competition between different parts? We did many different variants of this one. This was a version that I quite enjoyed aesthetically. Going back to the idea of beauty, as we were going through the process, there was a sense of trying to find the correct route to create our buildings. The second stage in it was the idea of dependency, of how these seeded habitats might start to cluster together to create individual buildings. So here, the points that were created by the seeding and growth pattern then start to huddle together to make the more tightly packed structures. Again, it comes out of the same starting algorithm, but adding into that, there's the sense of things pulling together. I call this clustering, but there's no particular reason for that. The next stage in this was to try and find a way to enclose these clusters. So again, continuing similar kind of algorithms and computing processes, finding a way of covering those clusters of living units. And this is just an animation showing that kind of enclosure growing up along the outside of those units. I was interested in how this is generating semi-automatic, semi-random forms, but at the same time, this is a process we're trying to steer because we've got an idea about how these things come together to make an urban place. At this point, we wanted to see, is there a way in which the inside of the building can start to manifest itself externally? So the next step in the process was adding in an algorithm which created the kind of flowering collars that had been part of Yael's project in the Room for London. This is a really jumpy animation, but I still quite like it. But here, as the buildings grow up, they start to try and find places for openings to the outside world and create these kind of expanding, like suckers that form collars. And moving through from that, the process for doing this starts to evolve and soften. This one's a bit too abstract, possibly, but again, here we have, you can just pick it up in the distance, these kind of flowering collars emerging out. At the same time, we're thinking about how we build the installation, and we're working with AKT2, a London-based engineering practice, and we started to take those forms that we created as part of the overall building and turn them into 3 elements that would be inside the exhibition. And AKT2 were able to help us take the forms we generated and turn them into something that we could make with our own hands. A bit like the steampunk guys, we're not great makers, but we thought we can use the machines to make us better makers. Unlike them, we use this as a way of creating cutting patterns rather than guiding our hand. So we kind of isolated the scheme down into these 3 forms that we felt could be made out of felt, rather. So we used, sorry, I need to press a button. We used a laser cutter to prepare the felt. Initially, we thought we'd just draw the patterns with it, but we realized we could actually directly cut it. And so over a couple of weeks, we had thousands of pieces of felt cut out for us, which we then assembled in the office into the kind of subcomponents for the installation. Also transforming the office into a kind of tanning factory for colouring up bits of felt. This is Davide, who's unable to be here, but who's a key part of our team. This is putting together the segment in the exhibition space, and we're really pleased to see how this very rigid computer cutting pattern turned itself into a very soft and friendly surface. The key part of our idea for a new kind of habitation is to create softer, more friendly habitations, and we're really pleased with the way that the felt components have maintained that. So another key part of what we were doing was the embedding of planting into the scheme. It doesn't necessarily show up here, and hopefully it shows up in the next slide, but we created an external wall structure which was intended to be a planting wall, a kind of potting shed. And we worked with a team here in Estonia to look at different plants that would work in that kind of environment, and developed a series of kind of grow bags out of felt that we could place into our external wall as part of the overall scheme. I think that wraps up what I have to say about the project. I just wanted to find if Yael wanted to add anything to that.
Oh, I think you did it perfectly well.
That's great.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you both. I wanted to maybe talk a little bit, Yael, about the oppositions that you've set up in the exhibit and the ways in which we're seeing the installations having a dialogue with one another. And I think the most striking dialogue is the one that exists between these 2 projects at first instance. But I think as you look at them a little more carefully, you begin to see the similarities in the ambition for both of the projects as we see them here. And I'm wondering from your perspective how you see that dialogue existing as both were coming to pass in the space.
I felt that we both share great interest in bringing nature in out relationship between culture and nature. People enjoy the garden in public place or in the private place. So that was it was clear. It was we're both very keen on that, and it was also for me very clear that using natural material like wood, we use felt and wood, so it's also kind of being ecologically kind of aware, but also highly important was the enhancing opportunities for people to meet each other, to enhance relationship with people, the people who inhabiting if it's a tower, if it's a block, if it's a vertical village, if it's how we create more opportunities. And I know Sou Fujimoto is really keen on that. I can see it to different projects, it's coming in and out. So though we share all this, I think, core interest in terms of, let's say, the content of the project, we are also extremely different from each other. So I'm very curious and interested in Sou Fujimoto, having this elegant minimalism and a new formal abstraction, which I can see it in different projects, and so we can say that the Serpentine Pavilion was very thin, so the elegance comes from the thinness and the lightness of the elements, and the segment we see here as part of series of your project is kind of wanting to be primitive and wooden blocks and heavy, but they both share same interest of this abstraction. And so you brought it very beautifully, you say, like an open cave, because there's no differentiation of the parts. And there's no differentiation of the parts if it's in the Serpentine Pavilion, or there's no differentiation of the parts in the habitation project you suggest here. So it's nice. I think it's interesting to see how, and we never discussed that, is how the project evolved. And so I find it very interesting that language-wise, architecturally, we chose a very different way of developing the project, or what it looks like at the end. But it actually share core interest. I find it also very interesting, and perhaps it's part of when we have architects coming from different parts of the world, there's certain things it's clearly we both share, and other things we don't. So I find it very interesting that for me, I admire Japan in many ways as a culture. Tokyo is my favorite city ever. And Japanese architecture I watch from the 80s, so kind of thoroughly. So I'm fascinated that there's how much Sana architecture is so different than what you are doing. But there's really sharing this affinity or interest in abstraction. Kind of almost going back to early modernism, and abstraction was kind of celebrated. But they do it very differently, so it's a new formal abstraction. And I'm very interested, I'm sorry, I have a question very related to that, to you, because you work now in France, and I can see your influence on the team, and the vertical villages, share qualities with the Serpentine Gallery. Yet the treehouse, I kind of see it more as it's becoming less, perhaps one can see it upside, but it's less transparent, it's less, it sure still has the qualities you're working on, but it has, I wonder if it's you just being influenced not by specific people or architects, but by a different culture. You have an office there. I wonder what you think about that in relation to...
Well, yeah, that's, I think, even for me, myself, it is quite interesting, ongoing process now, because not only the difference with Japan and France, but the size of the buildings, scale of the program is changing now in our studio. We are still doing the small things, but then the larger things are also happening. And the thinking of those kind of a segment and the whole, or the crossover scaling, is the interesting point is how we define the unit. In the case of the Serpentine, it's like this, and then the 2-centimeter bar. So it's quite like a tiny scales as a starting point, and then we can like a repeat or integrate or something like that. But it's also possible to start from, as this open cave starts from the timber block. It's rather massive. But this is another definition of the one unit segment. And then it is also could have the different way of the relationships. And then when the scale of the building is getting bigger, then I am enjoying to find out a new definition of the unit, or a new definition of the one segment. And depends on which unit you see it, then the whole configuration and the whole, the relationships is always changing. And then, of course, in case of the Montpellier project, each balconies is a really strong unit. And of course, we have like a thin handrails and many of those kind of small scales we have. But the main strong units is these balconies. So finally, it is like about 55-meter high building. So it's big anyway. And then I believe it has kind of the interesting duality of powerfulness and the delicateness, rather more close to the powerfulness. But of course, it was expected to be the landmark. So, and in such an urban context, I realized, wow, those kind of the fine-tune of the balances of the segments and the choice of the scales could create the different things, but still kind of a continuing fundamental thinkings are happening. And so, it is an ongoing process. And when I did the Serpentine, when I finished the Serpentine, I thought, wow, this super delicate scale was successful in that scale of the pavilions, 22 meter by 25 meter something. It makes sense. But if the whole scale of the building is like a double or triple times bigger, then this tininess is just could be the battering scales. So that was the moment I was very conscious about the balances or the interrelationships of each segment and the whole. And then it is like a living, ongoing experiment to see how we can reintegrate those kind of different things. Because as you said, in the city of Tokyo, it's fragmented, but it's a huge city. And that complexity is almost far beyond our artificial intentions. But it is happening. So that's kind of amazing examples. And that is the ongoing thinking now I have.
But Barnaby, just to pick up on that a little bit, the idea of ergonomics, and if we think about Sou's project is really talking about an extension of a modular or almost like the Ken or a tatami mat and understanding how the bigger piece is made. I'm interested from your perspective about the nature of the inhabitation of these spaces. You talked about them being soft, but is there something else that's going on with the curving of those smaller surfaces?
I was very interested when Sou started talking about the modules, because I'm still of that generation of architects where you get something, you start to try and break it down into something which you can use again. I had a recent project where I realized that what I really cared about was what was the height of the step on the staircase, and everything had to work with that, because I knew that was going to affect everything. And you get to a point in the construction project where they've sorted the levels out, and you go and survey it, and you discover whether or not your module is going to work with this very important dimension, and thank God it worked, and everything else hangs together. But actually, one thing I've started to appreciate is that it's great to have a module, but it's great when that module is not quite rigid. I write software, and one of the things I enjoy about software is the softness, is the way that you can create an algorithm which kind of does something, but it allows people to affect things. And so what you're creating is a human-controlled module that allows people to make something else out of it. And in architecture, our problem is we make things that are kind of permanent. It's very easy to talk about making a reconfigurable house or something like this, but in reality, stuff tends to have a stasis. The search, I suppose, that's embedded in our project is for some kind of architecture which is tolerant of change and where change isn't necessarily about reconfiguring the blocks, but it's about having what I would describe as a soft module, something which is able to absorb the sort of humanity of use of a building and to change and grow with that. We don't have a solution to that, but it's certainly embodied in what we were trying to achieve with the segment.
Unfortunately, our time is up. We could keep going for a little while on this one, but I think, again, thank you both. The dialogue between these two pieces is really compelling in the space. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really exciting. Thank you. Thank you.